After the Justice Department made millions of unredacted records, unredacted about convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, available for certain members of Congress to view today. Here's what Representatives Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna said they saw just moments ago. Take a listen.
What I saw that bothered me were the names of at least 6 men that have been redacted that are likely incriminated by their inclusion in these files.
Our bigger concern is that there's still a lot that's redacted, even in what we're seeing.
Here now joining us, Democratic Congressman Jared Moskowitz of Florida. He serves on the House Judiciary Committee. So, Congressman, you got a look at some of these files today.
Okay, so you know how Trump has spent years saying the 2020 election was stolen? Every rally, every interview, every late-night Truth Social post, same message on repeat. Massive fraud, rigged machines, fake ballots, the whole thing. Well, a federal judge just responded with 2 words. Prove it. And this isn't cable news hype. This isn't partisan spin. This is a federal court order. A judge has directed the FBI to unseal records tied to ballots seized in Georgia back in 2020. We're talking about the actual documents, the unredacted files, the material that's reportedly been sealed for years. No more summaries, no more secondhand descriptions, the raw records. And that changes the dynamic completely. Because once documents move from classified investigation to court-ordered disclosure, the conversation shifts from rhetoric to evidence. Now, Trump is reportedly not thrilled about this development. And depending on what those files show, or don't show, this could either reinforce his long-running claims or seriously undermine them. Either way, this just escalated. But before we go any further, let's break down exactly what this order means and why it could matter more than people realize. All right, let's get back to it.
The Epstein Files Transparency Act only allowed the Justice Department to withhold the personal information of the victims, the survivors, and material that would jeopardize active federal investigations. Did the redactions that you saw comply with the law? And tell us what you saw that concerned you.
Well, thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me. First, let me say, obviously, we're all hoping for Savannah's mom's speedy return to her family. So first of all, you go into the Department of Justice today, you go to the 10th floor of a building. There's nobody who works on that floor. You go into a room with 4 computers. The system that they set up for us to view these documents has a 24-page handbook on how to use it.
So here's what just happened, and it's not small. A federal judge has ordered the FBI to release documents connected to their seizure of 2020 election ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, and not at some vague point in the future, not months from now after endless delays, but by Tuesday, February 10th. The court didn't just say release them eventually. It made it clear that excessive redactions and blanket secrecy claims are not going to fly this time. The public, according to this ruling, has a right to see what actually happened. That alone makes this explosive because for years the Georgia ballot controversy has lived in the realm of political rhetoric, campaign speeches, cable news arguments, and social media posts. But now the conversation is about to shift from claims and counterclaims to documented federal investigative records. If you're someone who has believed from the beginning that the 2020 election was stolen, this might sound like vindication waiting to happen. You might be thinking this is the moment where everything Trump has been saying gets confirmed, that the FBI files will expose massive fraud and prove that Georgia was improperly decided. But here's the part that complicates that narrative. Trump's legal team is not celebrating this release. They are not demanding immediate transparency. They are reportedly fighting it, and that reaction is raising eyebrows, because if the documents contained definitive proof of widespread fraud, you would expect loud public demands to unseal everything immediately. Instead, there's resistance. That tension alone is enough to make this story far bigger than a routine document dispute. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to Georgia in November 2020. Trump lost the state by roughly 12,000 votes out of millions cast, a narrow margin, but a clear one. That result was confirmed by recounts and audits, yet Trump refused to accept it. He alleged suitcases of illegal ballots, dead voters, manipulated voting machines, and corrupt election workers. He insisted the state had been taken from him unfairly, and then came the now infamous phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where Trump urged him to find enough votes to reverse the outcome. That call was recorded and released, becoming one of the most scrutinized moments of the post-election period. But the call wasn't the only element of the Georgia saga. There were efforts to assemble alternate slates of electors, pressure campaigns directed at state officials, and demands for investigations into specific batches of ballots. At some point in that sequence of events, the FBI seized ballots as part of its investigative process. That fact alone has fueled speculation for years. Why were ballots taken? What prompted federal involvement? What did investigators discover? Until now, much of that has remained shielded from public view. The judge's order changes that dynamic. It forces transparency where secrecy has prevailed, and it introduces the possibility that concrete evidence could either validate or dismantle years of political messaging. What makes this even more dramatic is the timing. Trump is currently serving a second term. He has returned to the White House, rebuilt his political machine, and continued to frame the 2020 election as a defining injustice. That narrative has been central to his political identity and to the loyalty of his base. Now, in the middle of his presidency, a court is compelling the release of documents that could directly challenge the foundation of that narrative. Whether those files confirm his claims or contradict them, they will not be neutral. They will carry consequences. Let's slow this down and look at the mechanics, because the details matter. The FBI does not seize ballots casually. Such an action requires legal justification and typically arises from credible allegations that warrant examination. When agents secure physical ballots, they do so to preserve evidence, analyze claims, and determine whether criminal activity occurred. That investigative step alone does not prove fraud, but it does indicate that allegations were serious enough to merit scrutiny. The question now is not whether there was an investigation, but what that investigation concluded and how those conclusions were documented internally. Over the past several years, multiple audits, recounts, and court cases related to Georgia's election results have reached the same overarching conclusion. There was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to alter the outcome. Judges dismissed lawsuits, election officials reaffirmed tallies, Republican and Democratic administrators alike stated that the process, while imperfect as all large systems are, was fundamentally sound. Trump and his allies, however, continued to argue that hidden irregularities existed and that federal authorities were either complicit or unwilling to expose them. That narrative has persisted despite official findings to the contrary. The unsealing of FBI records could settle or reignite that debate. If the documents reveal that investigators thoroughly examined the claims and found no substantial fraud, it would significantly undermine the stolen election argument, at least in Georgia. It would suggest that the federal government looked, tested, analyzed, and concluded there was nothing there. On the other hand, if the files contain ambiguities, procedural concerns, or unresolved questions, Trump's allies would likely seize on them as proof that deeper issues were ignored. Either way, the content of these records will shape political discourse in real time. The broader implication goes beyond one state. Georgia was pivotal, but it was part of a larger strategy. Allegations were also directed at Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If the Georgia claims unravel under documentary scrutiny, skeptics may begin asking whether similar narratives in other states were equally unsupported. That domino effect is what makes this moment potentially transformative. Trump's political resurgence has been fueled in part by the conviction among his supporters that he was wronged in 2020. If concrete federal documentation contradicts that belief, it could create tension within his coalition. At the same time, it would be naive to assume that documentary evidence alone changes minds. Trump has cultivated a deep distrust of federal institutions among his base. For many supporters, agencies like the FBI are already viewed as politically biased. If the documents contradict Trump's claims, some will likely argue that the investigation itself was corrupt or incomplete. That dynamic sets up a clash not just over facts, but over trust. Do people believe the written record of federal investigators, or do they believe the president's interpretation of events? That divide may prove just as consequential as the contents of the files themselves. There is also a legal dimension that cannot be ignored. If the unsealed records indicate that Trump or his associates were aware that fraud claims lacked evidentiary support, that knowledge could be relevant in other proceedings. Intent matters in the law. A mistaken belief is different from a deliberate misrepresentation. If internal communications or investigative summaries show that claims were repeatedly debunked yet publicly amplified anyway, that distinction could have implications for ongoing or future cases tied to election interference, false elector strategies, or obstruction allegations. Transparency in one case can ripple outward into multiple arenas. From a political standpoint, this release arrives at a sensitive moment. Trump is not a former president defending his legacy. He is a sitting president governing again. His authority is current. His influence over federal agencies is real. The optics of a court compelling the disclosure of potentially damaging records during his tenure adds a layer of institutional tension. It underscores the independence of the judiciary, but it also places executive credibility under scrutiny. If the records contradict him, critics will argue that he built a political movement on misinformation. If they align with him, he will claim vindication and accuse opponents of years of deception. This situation also tests the resilience of democratic norms. Elections are foundational to the American system. Confidence in results, even when margins are slim, is essential to peaceful transitions of power. When a significant portion of the electorate believes an election was illegitimate, that trust erodes. The Georgia documents have the potential to either restore some measure of confidence or deepen skepticism. The reaction will likely depend less on what is written in the files and more on how influential voices frame their contents. There is a psychological element here as well. For years, many Americans have lived in parallel realities regarding 2020. In one version, Trump was unfairly denied victory through systemic fraud. In another, he lost and refused to concede. The release of official investigative records forces those realities into direct confrontation. It creates a moment where narrative meets documentation. Whether that collision clarifies or confuses the national conversation remains to be seen, but it guarantees heightened attention and renewed debate. As Tuesday approaches, anticipation is building. Media organizations are preparing analysis teams. Legal experts are reviewing procedural history. Political operatives are crafting responses in advance of whatever the documents contain. Once unsealed, the files will be dissected line by line. Statements will be compared against prior public claims. Context will be scrutinized. In today's hyper-connected environment, excerpts will circulate within minutes, shaping impressions before comprehensive reviews are even complete. The information cycle will move fast, and narratives will solidify quickly. What cannot be overstated is the significance of transparency. A federal judge determined that the public interest outweighs secrecy in this instance. That decision reflects a broader principle. In matters touching the integrity of national elections, sunlight is essential. Regardless of political allegiance, citizens benefit from access to primary documents. They allow independent assessment rather than reliance on filtered interpretations. In a polarized climate, primary sources carry a particular weight, even if consensus about their meaning remains elusive. Ultimately, this moment is about accountability and the durability of institutions. It is about whether claims that shaped a presidency withstand documentary scrutiny. It is about whether the justice system can operate independently, even when its findings intersect with powerful political figures. And it is about whether Americans are willing to examine evidence carefully, rather than defaulting to partisan reflexes. The release of these records will not end political division, but it will add substance to a debate that has too often relied on assertion alone. The story is unfolding quickly, and its impact will extend beyond Georgia. It will influence legal strategies, campaign messaging, and public trust. It may reaffirm beliefs or challenge them. What happens next depends not only on what is written in those FBI files, but on how the country responds to what it reads. Stay engaged, pay attention to the actual documents rather than just the headlines, and be ready to evaluate the evidence for yourself. If you want continued in-depth breakdowns as this develops, make sure you stay connected, follow for updates, and share this analysis so more people can understand what is truly at stake.